Well, thank you all for being here, and it's wonderful to see some familiar faces from my dim and distant past. I was a student here in the mid-90s in the Department of Chemistry, and so it's nice to be back and to be seeing some old familiar faces. So I confess, when I sent the title to Malcolm, I missed out a key word, not. But I'll begin the talk with the title as proposed. So the title given was Why Science and Spirituality Are Necessarily Incompatible. The fact that I teach both chemistry and theology may suggest that I might hold a different position, but let's begin from the beginning. So it really all depends on your perspective and how one understands how we get to know anything. So if we look back at science in the 20th century, it really was an era in which we came to understand the world in a much more detailed degree than we had prior to that. A couple of the major developments, if we look at physics, there was the explosion of thought that really can be attributed to Einstein. Firstly, the recognition that space and time can no longer be conceived as separate. Space-time is a single entity, which is actually quite mind-blowing. That's not how we experience the world. The second one, also that famous equation E equals mc squared. Energy and matter are directly related to one another. That, again, it changes everything in terms of how we understand the world. And of course, then later on in the 20th century, the whole notion of quantum physics. And if you were looking at my slides, you'll see a nice picture of Schrodinger's cat and the complexity that comes with our understanding of the wave-particle duality. Don't worry if you don't understand any of these terms. The point is that recognizing that our understanding of the world is much more complex than we had taken it to be up until that point. In chemistry, just before the start of the 20th century, a man called Arrhenius very nearly failed his PhD for suggesting that electrons could be separated from an atom. The implication was that the atom was divisible. It's a good thing for history that he didn't fail his PhD. But if you think about how far we've come nowadays, you can literally create a very complex molecule at the touch of a button. We have instruments that have now been developed that can automate a series of reactions to create very complex molecules. And I see Professor Kay in the background, who spent his life studying these things. It's not that all molecules can be created that way, but if you think of where we began the century, where we didn't know what the structure of an atom was. We knew that atoms existed, but we didn't actually know what that structure was. To being able to manipulate that structure into such complex, our synthetic capability of being able to create molecules is just tremendous. And biology, we went from Mendel's bean experiment. Okay, that's prior to the 20th century, but Mendel's experiment with playing around with beans and seeing how certain traits were inherited across generations, towards at the beginning of our century now, actually being able to create a synthetic cell, of having a genome that is entirely synthetic, being able to be put into a cell, and that cell being able to replicate. Again, it's remarkable when you think about what we understand. And more recently, the whole field of epigenetics, suggesting that actually our understanding of the genetic code is very good, but there's more. And so in certainly the 80s and 90s, there was a sense that, just to pick on two particular scientists, Stephen Hawking, at the end of his great book, A Brief History of Time, writes, If we find the answer to that, that is the theory of everything, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. Okay? And Francis Crick, who is of Watson and Crick fame, one of the people attributed with determining the structure of DNA, writes in his book, your memories and your sorrows, your joys, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of neurons. Ultimately, the whole of human behavior is reducible to what happens in our neurons. The position that they're both operating from is essentially, with sufficient time in the development of technology, we would be able to answer all questions. Okay. There may be some hubris associated with that. But it comes, one of the ways of thinking about that kind of development and seeing, particularly in recent years, some of the developments that are now happening in our world. One of the people who has spent a lot of time in the last century thinking about how human development arises is a man called Ken Wilber, and he developed something called integral theory. And he draws, essentially, he's a good magpie. He draws on the work of pretty much everybody else. But one of the things that he writes about is the development in terms of looking at, we had the period in human history where everything was magic, and then we moved on to the mythical. I'll explain these in a minute. So we had to move it from the magic to the mythic to the rational. Okay, the mythic is essentially what some would attribute to our religious understanding. And from that view, the mythic is better than the rational. That supersedes the rational. Sorry, the mythic supersedes the magic, and the rational supersedes the mythic. So once we've got the science, we no longer need God. Isn't it great? Except that that's not where development ends. So his argument would be that there are at least two, probably significantly more phases after that. The next one is the pluralistic, and after that the integral. The pluralistic, we're beginning to see evidence of that in terms of things like the call for decolonization, things like the call for the recognition of indigenous knowledge systems, that actually the rational is very good and very useful, but it's not the only way of knowing. There may be more than one way to interrogate the world. And the integral is then how you hold all of these views together. So for me, I find this is quite a useful way of thinking about things. Just going back to Hawking and Crick and that notion that science can explain everything, there are three problems that emerge from that view of science in the 20th century. The first one is something called the epistemic fallacy. Essentially, that is the conflation between the thing and our understanding of the thing, our knowledge of the thing, right? So it's mistaking, it's the conflation between the table itself and my thinking of this as a table. There's a separation between those two things, and that's important because the world is the world is the world. But our understanding of the world develops and changes over time. So when we fail to make that separation, we can take our concepts as given. And because our science is now quite reliable, actually, most of the chemistry that I learned 30 years ago, it's a bit shocking that it's 30 years ago now, over in the chemistry building at Rhodes, Actually, the first year chemistry students learn pretty much the same thing today. That probably wasn't entirely true between 1960 and 1990, right? But we've reached a level, particularly in chemistry, where we're fairly sure that we know what we're talking about because the concepts are reliable. So it's very easy to fail to make that distinction. The second issue is reductionism. And that is that if we just understood the physics well enough, we could explain human behavior. This fails to account for what's known as emergence. The properties of molecules are not entirely explainable. They're not predictable, if I can put it that way, from the laws of physics. We can explain them in terms of the laws of physics, but they're not, if we only know the physics, we can't predict chemistry. We certainly can't predict biology, and we certainly can't predict human behavior. And at each level that we go up, there's another level of complexity that has an existence in its own right, that is beyond the physical particle. And the third issue is kind of the one that interests me most. I won't talk to it very much today, but the conflation between the objectivity of science and the objectivity of scientists. That which we study is a real physical thing, and when I look at that, I can look at it in a particular way and develop a concept, and somebody else can come along and test that concept. But the development of that concept itself is highly dependent on when I was born. The chemistry that we know now is different to the chemistry that we knew 50 years ago. It depends on where I am in the world and how I was trained. It depends on what language I speak, because different languages have different mental models and have the different capacity for different mental models. So the practice of science allows us to give reliable, robust knowledge, but that's not some magic quality of the person. The magic quality of the scientist is the ability to describe their thinking in such a way that somebody else can follow it. So one of the things that I found very useful in thinking about this is I came across the work of a man called Roy Bhaskar, who was started out life as an economist and then switched to philosophy when he realized that he couldn't actually predict much with economics. And he came up with a description of the world. His driving question was, what must the world be like if science is possible, if we can describe the world in this way? And he comes up with sort of a triad, sort of a three-tiered understanding of the world. We have the real, everything that exists, including all possible mechanisms, everything that might happen, or everything that, the mechanisms that might cause anything to happen, I should say. A subset of that are the actual events, the things that actually happen, because not all things that are possible actually happen. And then a subset of that are the empirical, that which we observe, because not everything that happens is observable. And the realm of science is really looking at, the magic of science is taking some empirical observation, and if you happen to be a chemist like me, your realm of observation would be a round bottom flask. So you separate your little reaction into your round bottom flask, isolate it from the rest of the world, and test that reaction until you know that this is how it works. If I add X and Y together, I'm going to get Z. And I test it over and over and over until I know that that's what happens. And then I let people experiment with that. And it may be that I'm absolutely right. It may be that I'm partially right. It may be that I didn't realize that I was using a particular solvent which was actually causing the reaction and not something else. So the scientist in Bhaskar's world is not a passive observer of the world, they're an active agent in the process, right? We're taking that little subset round bottom flask and doing the thing there. And the implication of that then is, of course, that the scientist is not the locus of the objectivity, the thing in the flask is the locus of objectivity. So this then gives rise to an important understanding of, and I'll talk about the field of chemistry because it's my own field, where there are three different domains that intersect to make chemistry. There's the physical world, the thing in the round bottom flask. There's what I call the canon of chemistry, the thing that we understand, right? The way, the words that we've used and the concepts that we've used and the ideas that we've used to describe what's happening in that flask. Those two things are not the same, they're separate from one another. And then here's the part that we as scientists often forget. There's the community of chemists. Okay? The canon of chemistry is defined by the community of chemists. A chemical concept is only a chemical concept when another chemist decides to use it. Until then, it's a nice idea in my head. Right? So chemistry, the chemistry is a social activity. And so we have this space where it is the community of chemists who decide what is reliably the canon of chemistry. And hopefully we're reasonably good at that. But as I think it, trying to remember who it was now, I've lost track of it. I think it was Heisenberg who said theories are overturned one funeral at a time, right? Meaning some of us find it hard to let go of the understanding that we have had. So this gives rise, this kind of understanding of the intersection between the physical world, the conceptual world, and the social world, the round bottom flask, the canon of chemistry, and the community of chemists, give rise to two understandings of chemistry. I promise you I'm getting onto spirituality soon. Gives rise to two understandings of chemistry. Chemistry is science, where we take the real world as fixed, and we're trying to develop concepts to describe the real world. Now, for the most part, that was the kind of chemistry that was happening very much in the early 20th century. We were trying to figure out how to robustly describe the world. Nowadays, our conceptual understanding is pretty robust. And most of us, I speak for myself here, take the concepts as given and use the concepts to shape the real world. So, in my case, when I was doing chemistry research, that was making new molecules. I wasn't developing concepts to make new molecules. I was simply using them and going, ooh, let's see, if we add this and this together, we should get that. Oh, look, that happened. Yay. Moving onwards. That kind of chemistry, I would call chemistry as technology. Okay? It's very, very useful, but it's a different kind of a thing. So here's where the segue begins. What about spirituality? What about religion? How can we think about using a similar framing of, I'll call it the world generally, and then our religious understanding, and then the community of faith? What happens when we think about our religious traditions, our religious practices in those terms? What happens? Firstly, we cannot interrogate. I don't think we can interrogate. I don't think we can claim to interrogate the spiritual world in quite the same way that we interrogate the physical world. And one of the biggest problems with that is that matters of faith always seem to be mediated through personal experience. And my personal experience is not reproducible in you. It's particular. So these things are not testable in the same way in the physical world. But if we go back to Bhaskar and think about the empirical and the actual and the real, does this, just because we can't interrogate it in the same way, are we sure that it's no less real? Okay. So if we extend, I'm going to leave lots of time for questions at the end, by the way. If we extend that metaphor of chemistry as science and chemistry as technology to religion, it gives us a couple of uncomfortable insights. If we think of religion as science, and we take the spiritual as being something real that we can investigate, we again need to be very careful about the epistemic fallacy. Do we take our concepts of God as God? Right? I think many people of faith don't make that distinction. That our descriptions of God, look, it says so in the Bible. It's there in the text. Okay. And then people forget that we're actually interpreting the text when we read the text like that. So for the most part, our theological arguments are epistemological, not ontological. Our arguments are about the concepts of God, and actually for the most part pay very little attention to God's action in the world. So academic theology, for the most part, it's not exclusively so, but for the most part, academic theology very much operates through the paradigm of hermeneutics, which is looking at different ways of interpreting, different ways of reading things, which is very interesting and very lovely. But if that's divorced from religious experience, what is it? So that's the first uncomfortable insight of saying, okay, well, there may be really good value to hermeneutics, and certainly a lot of the readings, sort of feminist readings or whatever of the Bible, do bring new insights and new senses of who God might be. But we do need to be very careful not to conflate God with our concepts of God. And if we think over history, how many people have literally died over arguments over the concept of God? We need to be careful. The second insight is if we take religion as technology. If we don't worry too much, right? If we take religion as, actually, if I just take the concepts as given and allow that to shape my way of being in the world, then, and take the purpose of spirituality, the purpose of religion in that sense, is the transformation of humanity. And for transformation of humanity, if you read that in the broadest possible sense, which could include salvation, then actually, again, we don't have to have big arguments about what sort of, we've got so caught up in the intellectual argument of whether this is right or this is right. We miss the point that actually each spiritual tradition has its own technology of how to facilitate human transformation. And when we argue about the minutiae of whether you believe in the virgin birth or not, we kind of miss the point, right? Each system, take each system as a whole. Don't try and pull the belief of the virgin birth out of Catholicism. I speak as a Catholic, by the way. Don't try and do that, but let's not argue over whether that's entirely accurate or not, because it misses the point. The point is the transformation of the human person. So there are two implications to that. One, theological arguments should not be divorced from a religious experience. And secondly, it is potential that our theology could be completely wrong and still afford human transformation. Right? So I should probably at this point declare my own position. I am a practicing Roman Catholic and I take my faith very seriously. I am who I am today because of my spiritual practice. And if the theology proved wrong tomorrow, I would be saying, okay, what's next? How do we understand this better? So one can take one's faith extremely seriously and not get caught in the detail, because the detail is about the concept. It isn't about God. And so ultimately, in the end, then, I think we're left with this notion that in the same way that thinking about, if we think that science is the only way to interrogate the world, we limit ourselves in our understanding of what is possible. But if we're going to do that, then we also need to apply a similar kind of logic to our religious space. To say, I will happily take this extremely seriously and hold it very lightly. In the same way that our scientific concepts, they're concepts. They're very useful. But we may find better descriptions. So I realize I've spoken for about half an hour, which has left us lots of time for questions. I realize that I've gone through a lot of kind of conceptual stuff, so I apologize for that. It would have been slightly easier if you could follow me on the slides. But I think for me, in the end, these things are not incompatible. We just need to understand how we think about them. And if you're not really interested in understanding how we think about them, that's fine. That's okay. Just get on and do it. But let's not argue too much about who's right and who's wrong.
I don't need to apologize for anything, absolutely not. Thank you so much, mate. Questions, comments? Right, Pat.
How would you differentiate between religion and spirituality?
How would I differentiate between religion and spirituality? So I think that they are overlapping. I don't think that they are completely, it's sort of a Venn diagram, they overlap with one another. So I think that for the most part, religion is the frame in which spirituality is held. I think spirituality for me is about who I am in the world and how I relate to that which is, which includes people, the world, the physical world, and God. And religion is our attempt to describe that in a way that allows for that personal transformation. That would be my, it may not be.
If I was to put it to you for
Sure.
argument's sake, organized religion is one of the bones of humanity, but spirituality is one of the finest aspects of humanity. How would you...
How would I say that?
This is question response.
Sure. So the question is if he's saying religion is one of the banes, organized religion is one of the banes of humanity, and spirituality is one of the greatest gifts of humanity, I would say that if we look at someone like Jung, he would say that there's a shadow side to everything. And I think that organized religion has a tremendous amount to answer for. But I think if we ditched it, we would find that we had lost more than we think. So I don't think that those two things are totally separable. That's my position.
Doug?
I'd like to comment briefly about what he just said and then ask my question if
Sure.
you don't mind. I have heard it said that religion is what happens to people who are afraid of going to hell. Spirituality is what happens to people who have been there. Now, my question is this. Let us say we have a coin.
Mm-hmm.
On one side of the coin is an image.
Mhm.
Makes no difference what the image is.
Sure.
It's an image. Let's call the one side the material interpretation of the world and everything it implies, physics, chemistry, astronomy, etc.
Mm-hmm.
That image is on one side and it's everything physical. On the other side is our image of everything spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it has a named spiritual religion, as in Buddhism, Catholicism, Hinduism,
Yeah.
or the concepts that underlie spirituality. That's printed on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
The material on one side, spiritual. What's in the middle? Is there a word, transcendentalism,
Right.
fits
So,
that
yeah.
issue of what is in the middle, and if so, what is it that is transcendental?
That's an excellent question, and I don't have an immediate answer. I guess my instinct would be to say, I'm not sure that they're two sides of the coin. I think it's one whole. So,
May I just
sorry.
say something there? Is it possible that our knowledge of consciousness per se is insufficient to be able to bridge those two things? And I know consciousness is a hell of a big question mark, and it may be that until or unless we have a better concept of consciousness, we really, in a sense, don't know what the hell we're doing in terms of that debate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that is a fair point. I think I'm hesitant to separate the material world from the spiritual world. I think that they are inextricably intertwined. That's not to say that they're completely the same, but I don't think one side of the coin and the other works as a metaphor in my understanding.
I don't want to dominate the floor with the questions and things, but I study a lot of astrophysics,
Okay?
particularly the large-scale universe.
Right.
It is so vast and extends over such extended periods of time that we cannot even begin to understand in our tiny little humanness
Yeah.
how big, how slow, and how deliberate it is.
Yeah.
When I study the details of all of this, and it gets to be a very complicated subject,
Sure.
I get the idea that the universe is a living being.
Right.
It behaves like one on scales of time so slow we can't understand. A billion years to an astronomer is what they call instantaneous. A billion years.
Beautiful.
My feeling is that God and the universe are both
one.
alive and the same thing.
Right. Cool. I would like to talk to you more about that. It's a really beautiful perspective.
Hello?
As you're talking, in a James Bond, it comes out of Fritjof Capra's The Turning Point, where from the big universe down to a molecule of sugar
Mm-hmm.
that contains 3 atoms, none of which are sweet in themselves.
Yeah.
It's a relationship which has an image of a feeling of spirituality about it
Mm-hmm.
that makes it what it is.
Yeah.
And I find that perhaps a more useful one than poems.
Yeah. It's really interesting actually that you bring up that notion of relationship. So there's a very interesting psychiatrist turned philosopher called Ian McGilchrist, who's been writing recently. His first book came out 2012, I think, called The Master and His Emissary, and his recent tome of a book that came out about 18 months ago is called The Matter with Things. And part of our issue is that we have, particularly in the Western world, right, our Western scientific understanding is that we have learned how to pull things apart in order to analyze them. And so we think of ourselves as individuals, right? But actually, and that's the matter with things, right? Actually, it's time to pay attention to the relationality, because it's in the relationship there will be new insight in the relationship. And to me, that's a fascinating notion. And I think if we are to solve if we're to solve issues like climate change, we need to have a deep understanding of relationality. We're not going to solve it by pulling it apart, or by only pulling it apart.
Have you read, as a matter of interest, have you read anything by Carlo Rovelli
I have not.
on, what do we call it, quantum physics? And he emphasizes
yes.
this point that Mrs. Holloman has
Yes.
made about interrelationships.
Yes.
And the physicists, as you would know, have been concerned with explaining something about locality and non-locality, which quantum physics highlighted.
Mm.
And he's written at least 2 wonderful books on this sort of thing. And the quantum physicists are in the process of trying to explain and understand the apparent conflict between non-locality and Einstein's maximum velocity of things.
Yeah.
And the way he tried, well, I think the avenue through which he does it is by interconnectedness of everything. And your time frames may obviously differ, but interconnectedness is the point that obviously that Kepler makes in his systematic systems view of life, which is a wonderful, wonderful book.
Yeah.
And Rovelli, to my mind, is saying the same sort of thing in relation to quantum physics, but expanding it to the holistic.
Right.
aspect.
Excellent. Thanks, Sirion.
On the matter of religious experience,
Mm-hmm.
would you like to say anything about the experience of mystics, which is...
Sure. That was not a question that I anticipated. So I think in terms of the experience of mystics, my own position on that is that we have to take the experience seriously. If you look at somebody like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, even Ignatius of Loyola, something happens to them that is extraordinary. Now, how do we explain that? We can attempt to explain that using psychology. We can attempt to explain that using God. We can attempt to explain that using whatever else we want to use. My own position would be that actually, what's the fruit, right? What changed? and what's the impact of that change on the world. If you take someone like John of the Cross and that notion of the dark night of the soul, something happened to him in that little room that for the last 500 years, people have been reading and resonating with. What was that? I don't know, but there's something deeply human about it, and I would say that there's something of an encounter or non-encounter with God that happens in that space. That's real. So my position is, if we dare to take it as, what happens if we dare to trust it? What do we learn? And if it turns out that actually it wasn't, there was nothing there at all, we still might have learned something in the process. So I on all of these things, my position is very much, I'll choose to trust and hold it lightly.
Walk softly and carry a big stick.
Not quite what I meant, but sure.
Stephen.
From your personal perspective, have you had a struggle between your personal perspective of Catholicism and your personal perspective of science?
Okay.
You need to repeat the question.
I will. So the question is, have I personally had a struggle between my personal experience of faith and my experience of science? Probably. As a good undergraduate, I went through the "what is this all about" thing, and took Pascal's wager, meaning it was better to believe and be a bit wrong. That was my position at the end of my undergraduate degree. On balance, my praying each night only cost me 10 minutes. What was the big deal? If God existed, all was well. If God didn't exist, it didn't cost me that much. And then I then had spent a year teaching before I went on to do honors. And during that year, I happened to be teaching at a Jesuit school in Harare. I went on I decided that it was time to actually explore. Like, Pascal's wager was fine, but let's be a little bit, the pragmatism of that was great, but let's be a little bit more, let's interrogate it a little bit more. And that year then set me up. I ended up having a couple of significant experiences that year, which kind of set me up for the rest of my life. I spent 4 years between completing my PhD and coming back to academia, working in a Jesuit retreat house in the UK, where my job was guiding people through 8-day retreats. And it's a long way to answer your question, but I think it's kind of the only answer that I have. And through 8-day retreats.
Oh, sorry, I didn't catch.
So people would come in, they would be silent for 8 days. The only person that they would talk to would be me. And in the beginning, so I had trained as a spiritual director at this point. In the beginning, I used to think that I knew what the retreat was going to be about. They would come in on the first day and they would tell me, a little bit about their life story. And I'd be like, okay, I've got this. This is what the retreat's going to be about. And I began to realize that I was almost always wrong. And I began to realize that actually, if I just waited and kept helping them stay with that which seemed to be experience of God, around about day 5 or 6, something would happen, and the real retreat would happen, and their reason for coming would be made clear, and it was utterly delightful. And that helped me to trust fully in people's description of their experience of God, even when it was different to mine. And from that time, I've never seen a conflict between science is a way of interrogating the world. I'm probably not going to pray in front of my round bottom flask. I might. I haven't. But I don't see that those worlds are incompatible at all. I think that they're just a different way. You're looking at a different thing. In science, you're looking at the physical world with a particular view, particular perspective. As a person of faith, I can look at my faith life in a similar manner. So I think being a scientist has affected my faith more than my faith has affected being a scientist. So, yeah, I don't see that there's a conflict between them, and I've never really struggled with that.
Helen?
Sorry, it's me again.
Don't after it.
What you're describing makes me think of an insect's compound eye,
Mm-hmm.
where each little shines a very clear vision.
Yeah,
Then when it's on the whole lens, it's slightly blurry, but you've got a bigger picture.
right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's less. I like the slightly blurry bit. I think that's entirely true. Yeah.
I've really been blessed to have had 3 mystical experiences.
Mm-hmm.
One fundamental constant that comes out of the feeling is unimaginable. You cannot put it into human words. It's beyond humanity.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that has stayed constant throughout is the overwhelming presence of love.
Mm-hmm.
Now, St. John of the Cross had his experience. Mine is that the universe, God, and everything else is love.
That's beautiful. And I think.
That's the J.K. Rowling interpretation as well.
Yeah, and I think that through the dark night of the soul, John of the Cross would not. He is still talking about love. It's still an experience of love. It's just a very different one. Yeah.
Personally, I prefer Teresa of Avila.
So do I.
First pattern, man. First pattern.
Given there is some evidence for the reality of reincarnation,
Mm-hmm.
what, if one has an open mind about it, what might the relationship between reincarnation and physics and chemistry be?
No clue.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. What's the relationship between reincarnation and physics and chemistry? And my answer is I haven't a clue. Some people may have thought about this. I haven't. I'm not even going to venture an answer to that. It's a great question. I don't know the answer.
Okay.
But you was
Your question.
Sorry, as a scientist, can you give us some insight into reality and spirituality where people have reported experiences of near death,
Mm-hmm.
where they've seen themselves rising up their bodies and going into the light and all that type of stuff? Could you give us some insight into that?
So in terms of the physicality of that, we don't really know. But enough people have reported similar kinds of experiences that there is some commonality to that experience. Exactly what's happening there, again, I'm going to say, I don't know. I haven't given much thought to the hereafter because I fully trust if God is God, all is well. For now I'm here, my focus is here. So I haven't really thought much about reincarnation or what happens next. I trust in the grace of God.
Virginia, you had a question?
It was just a quote that
Mm-hmm.
from the point of view of the caterpillar, that's the egg.
Yeah.
But from the point of view of the last observing it, it's a butterfly.
Right. So the point of view of the caterpillar, it's all over. From the point of view of the master, it's a
really
butterfly on its way.
And maybe that is an answer to reincarnation.
Maybe it is. I don't know. I'm just not gonna. I'm just not gonna.
If you believe that, you make dents all over the religious philosophies of a lot of people.
Well, so again, I'm going to say I will hold to my tradition, and hold it lightly. We could be wrong. I'm okay with that. So actually, yeah, I'll talk about here and now.
Okay, you had a question?
I was just putting things in pedestrian terms.
Sure.
If we know what happens to the body at death, it
Mhm.
breaks up and all the elements and molecules and what are redistributed in the earth and made use of.
Yeah.
But we don't have a handle on is the consciousness because the only sort of semi-consciousness we know is sleep, and
Yeah.
good gracious, it's a marvelous to switch off at night and wake up in the morning and
Yeah. Yeah.
you can't explain where you were or what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. So saying that, we're fairly sure what happens to the body after death, right? You disintegrate.
Sorry, can I just get in
Sure.
one more semi-serious point that's been occurring to me repeatedly with some of this discussion? One of the members of our local intelligentsia,
Mm-hmm.
of whom we have many, is a big quiz whiz. We have quizzes here. And he's a very, very well educated and thoughtful person. And he once remarked to me in Pick and Pay,
Of course.
but he considered it to be better to be confident and wrong than hesitantly correct. That is a philosophy that you can take wider than just answering quiz questions. It gives you confidence.
So that, unfortunately, in the world in which we live, it appears that those who know less are more confident.
Yes. The intelligent are full of doubt. Bertrand Russell said that.
I will stick to my hesitant position.
Malcolm, do you think you could send us the names of the authors of the books that have been mentioned?
I can surely do that, yeah.
That might be helpful.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe Therese?
I'm just, why don't we have talks like this more often? I mean, I'm listening to the gentleman over there speak. When are you coming? I'm speaking, Doug, at the end, when are you coming to talk to us? This stuff is fabulous.
Isn't it amazing? Then we'll go to Lady Julian of Norwich and say, and all shall be well, and the matter of things shall be well. And that's not Pollyanna speaking.
No.
Thank you, everyone.
Good.
And thank you particularly to Matt.